I am from Idaho, but I did my grad school, so I went to the University of Minnesota, where I studied corn. So I did a lot of work with nitrogen, rate, source, time, placement, working with Dr. Fabian Fernandez, and so it's kind of nice to be back in the Midwest, and it's a little bit colder here today than it is in Idaho, but that's okay. Today I'm going to be talking. So when I left Minnesota, I went and joined the University of Idaho at one of their at the Aberdeen Research and Extension Center, which is in south central Idaho or southeastern Idaho. And over there, my job is the barley agronomist. So I went from corn to barley. And so in Idaho, a lot of our nutrient management guidelines were last updated in about 1980 using 1970s data. We did have a few updates in 2000, but they're pretty minor. And so really we were trying to make recommendations for all of our crop nutrients using really old data, using really old barley varieties, and the same for wheat. And so when I first arrived, my overall objective and goal was to really update and just double check our nutrient management guidelines. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. I've tried to bring in some information that hopefully will be helpful for you as well and be relevant for your cropping systems. But like I was saying, my goal is to provide information on sustainable irrigated and dryland barley production, as well as wheat. I also do a little bit with mustard and with some alfalfa, but my main emphasis is that barley. In my program, we look at malt, feed, food, or wholeless food, and forage barleys. And so you can see a couple of examples here. So you're probably very familiar with the malt and the feeds. But what you may not be as familiar with is a food barley. So food barley, when you thresh it, for the most part, that husk comes off like wheat. There may still be a little bit that adheres. So that's what you can kind of see in the central picture is some wholeless barley. And one of the reasons it's being marketed and grown out of Idaho, it usually gets shipped back to the Asian countries. So like Japan as a rice substitute, interestingly enough. So Japan, Korea. And so it's kind of an interesting, but they like it because it has higher protein and higher beta glucan. And so it's considered a heart healthy barley. And then like on that last picture, we do some forage barleys as well. We especially like the forage barleys because in years when our water gets cut, we do not have the irrigation reserves that we necessarily need. We can cut this barley at soft dough, and it doesn't have the awns that will could get lodged in the cattle's throats and the eyes and be obnoxious. So that's one of the reasons why we'll grow some of these awnless forage barleys. We also have some 6-row forage barleys that I think are really cool when you look out in the field and you see these yellow tops out there. And it's like, what is that? What is that crop out there that's got this yellow coating out there? It's really cool. All right, so with any nutrient recommendation system, our overall goal is to really estimate the gap between what can the soil supply that growing season to what the crop's going to need in order to optimize its production. And so kind of with the 4 R's, we know that we need to have the right rate, we need to have the right source, the right time, and the right placement. And it's anyone's guess if this year's going to be the year when I guess what my right rate is going to be the right rate. It may not. I may have guessed right, and I may guess wrong, depending on if we get irrigation, if our irrigation gets cut in our case, or if you get the rain. And so it's always trying to balance the best of all those different aspects. But like I said, there's complicating factors. The temperature. You may go out and apply a bunch of nitrogen fertilizer and incorporate it 2 inches down and protect it from volatilization, but temperature stayed cold until whenever, and my corn crop is not really growing that well, and so it's not really able to take as much advantage of that nitrogen that's there. And then also it never rained, and so I used ESN this year, and oh darn, it's stuck in that prill and it's not getting out in a timely fashion. So all of these different factors can have complicating effects on nutrient management. Another thing that we have to consider with nutrient management systems is how much of that nutrient is actually going to be removed at harvest. And do you ever stop and consider what's the value of the nutrient that's being exported in the grain? Or what's the value of the nutrient that's being exported in the straw? And so we decide to look at some of these these exports. What's the replacement cost if we were to replace all the potassium that's coming out in the straw with fertilizer? And so we are typically running variety trials across southeastern Idaho, multiple locations, multiple classes of wheat and barley. And so in this case, we'll be looking at hard red, hard white, spring and winter wheats, as well as some soft white winters. Like I said, there's about 2 to 6 locations and multiple growing environments. And so you will not probably be able to read this y-axis, and that's okay. You don't need to. The main thing is each of those colors represents a different class of wheat that we're looking at. And so we've got the hard reds, the hard whites, etc. But if you notice, they all have a linear response. So on the x-axis to grain yield, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a linear response of nutrient, whether that be nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium, to increasing yields. So that's the main takeaway here. Now, I will tell you some of the magnitudes. So for example, for nitrogen, our magnitudes go anywhere from 0 to 300. That's our scale. And so nitrogen is it's the most concentrated nutrient that's being exported in our grain. But we also have quite a bit of phosphorus and potassium that's being exported as well. And so if we were to assume, okay, in Idaho, we can normally achieve under irrigated conditions anywhere from 120 to 150-ish bushels to the acre. That may be higher or lower compared to what you're able to achieve, depending on where you are. And so I just looked at these removal rates for irrigated wheat at 100 bushels to the acre, because that makes math easy. And so for nitrogen, if we're producing 100 bushel wheat, we're exporting about 145 pounds of nitrogen. For phosphorus, it's about 25 pounds. For potassium, it's about 25 pounds. Calcium's 3, magnesium's 9, sulfur's 9, manganese is only 0.25, and zinc is 0.2. And so there we go. That's how much of these different nutrients in pounds per acre that we're removing if we're producing 100 bushel per acre wheat. When we look at the straw, so in Idaho, many of my grain producers are baling that straw, and it's going into the dairy system. It's being used as bedding predominantly, and so most of that biomass is being removed and exported as well. And so when we look at nitrogen, we've got much lower amounts going off in the straw. It's only 33 pounds. Phosphorus is very low as well. It's only 2. But now we look at the potassium. It's 170 pounds of potassium that's being exported in this straw, and also calcium. Also of interest is the sulfur is about the same amount in the straw as it is in the grain. And we can look at this in terms of harvest index. So basically we're taking the total above ground biomass of grain plus straw and then dividing it by whatever we're looking at. So in this case, on this column, we're looking at grain nutrients. On this column, we're looking at residue. And so if we think about carbon, 50% of the carbon that's being captured by the barley or the wheat crop is being exported in the grain, and 50% would be exported in the straw. So we can look at this, 81% of it's nitrogen, 92% of it is, for the grain, 81% of the nitrogen is being exported in the grain, 92% of the phosphorus, 59% of the magnesium and sulfur and zinc. And so if we're exporting just grain, those are the main nutrients that we need to be paying attention to. But if we're exporting straw as well, then on the straw side, it's a lot of potassium and the calcium and the sulfur. And so it's really paying attention to what are you exporting off the farm in terms of what am I going to have to replace. And so for us, nitrogen, it's a given. We have to bring in nitrogen. It's a very leaky nutrient. That's usually our biggest input in Idaho. But for potassium, our soils have historically tested over 400 parts per million potassium. So for us, we have the luxury of mining potassium out of our soils because we've got a lot there and we don't really see a crop response to most of our crops. Over the last 40 years, it's gone from about 400 parts per million to about 250 parts per million. So we're starting to get closer to that critical threshold where we might need to apply a little bit more eventually. But for the most part, we do not see responses to potassium, which is good for us, but it could be bad for you because when we look at our average fertilizer prices over the last couple of years for Idaho, Potassium is actually our biggest. If we had to replace the amount of potassium that we're mining and exporting out in our grain or in our straw, it'd probably be cost prohibitive for us to replace the potassium that is being exported out of the straw biomass. And so for us, it'd actually be better to, if we had to actually pay attention to that, to leave the straw biomass there rather than exporting it out. And so that's just some things from an Idahoan's perspective of nutrient removal. Listening to Brady this morning, it sounds like potassium is a bigger issue, and sulfur and phosphorus and a lot of these different nutrients. And so it could be very beneficial to pay attention to these nutrients and what's actually being removed. For barley, we see very, very similar results. So we're not going to go through everything. We'll just note a few things. So nitrogen was about the same as the wheat for both straw and grain. The potassium was actually lower by about half. So instead of 170 to 180 pounds of potassium being removed, it was closer to about 85 pounds. So barley is going to remove less or export less potassium, but the phosphorus is actually higher in the barley. And so that's something that was interesting for us to observe. Now I'd like to mention a few other nutrients that we've been working on. So phosphorus is one, sulfur, and if we have time, if Brady doesn't cut, we'll see when Brady cuts me off, I may get to some nitrogen data. Phosphorus is critical for small grain production because it helps with our early root development, tillering, grain yield, plant proteins, but also because it is the currency that the plant uses to transfer energy. So you have so when you have your chlorophyll and it's capturing that sunlight, it's got to convert it into some type of energy and move it to the rest of the plant in order for the plant to take that energy and use it in all of its different metabolisms. And so it uses adenosine triphosphate and it's adenosine diphosphate. So basically you got 3 phosphorus chains. It's going to cleave one of those to release energy. And it's going to bind one of the phosphorus units back onto that chain in order to store that energy. So it's how it's moving energy around. And as you know very well, phosphorus it's essential, but it can also be a very negative nutrient if it's getting into our waterways. And so it's one of those nutrients that, like nitrogen, we have to pay close attention to. Soil pH is going to be a strong influence or a factor driving phosphorus availability. So where I'm at, down here in southern Idaho, we have high pH, very calcareous soils. Our soils can range anywhere from 3% free lime to about 25% free lime. So very similar in many instances to some of the soils that you guys have up here. But in certain sections of Idaho, say up by Yellowstone or along the eastern board or up in northern Idaho, we have acidic soils. And so depending on what a soil pH is of our soil, that's going to affect what type of reactions and nutrients that we're trying to pay attention to are going to have. And so in this case, if for phosphorus that we're talking about, if we get below about a pH 6, phosphorus is going to be tied up generally with iron and aluminum oxides, and then at higher pHs, it's usually with calcium. And so just kind of looking at phosphorus generally, we have the biological fraction that is being immobilized by microbes or by the plant, or it's degrading off of dead material. But then we also have, on the chemical side, we have our soil. We have some sorption where it's being absorbed or sorbed to the outside edges of these soils. And those are generally weaker attractions, and so they're usually a little bit easier to break off that phosphorus, and especially on our acidic soil. So it's binding, or it's attracted to those iron and aluminum oxides. But we also have precipitation reactions, and so we can form insoluble iron and aluminum phosphates, or if it's in a calcareous soil, then we can have these weaker attractions on calcium, or eventually it becomes insoluble carbonated hydroxyapatite. And so some research out of Idaho looking at that, we had 3 different soils, a Jordan, a Canal, and a Millville soil. And you can see with our incubation time, if we apply our phosphorus fertilizer, whatever it is, triple superphosphate, MAP, DAP, whatever it is, within the first 60 days, we have a much faster reaction time across these 3 soils. And then over time, that reaction is much slower. So you can apply your phosphorus and it's going to be available to the crop. But you're going to have the much faster reaction earlier to the time of application. And so that's one of the for us, we recommend applying our phosphorus in the spring rather than in the fall, just because we want it to have less time to be bound up to soil minerals. In your soils where you have higher soil organic matter than what we have, you can have some of those complexing reactions that can help to keep that phosphorus more readily available to the plant. But in our soils where we have 0.8 to a really good soil that have 2% organic matter, we have to really pay attention to phosphorus. And in fact, we'll get to that one in a second. Additionally, warmer soils are going to affect how quickly that phosphorus is reacting in our soils. And so warmer soils are going to have much faster reaction time and then be much more available if it's a colder soil. And so that's why we try and apply our phosphorus early in the spring. So it's still plant available. It's there where the crop roots are going to need it. Also with colder soils, we have less diffusion of that phosphorus. And so you may see in your corn or your small grains purpling of your leaves, even if the soil test is high, but it's not getting that diffusion of that phosphorus to the roots. You can still see that purpling. And then as soon as the soils warm up, it goes away. And you're like, what happened? Well, some of that phosphorus is actually able to move. Now, speaking of banding, when I was at Minnesota studying corn systems, it was preached to me, you shall band your phosphorus fertilizer. You can reduce your rate by half, and it will be a more efficient and effective way to apply your phosphorus fertilizer. So I went to Idaho and said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to try banding our fertilizer. And one of my contemporaries, Dr. Juliet Marshall, who is also a plant pathologist, you may have heard of her in that realm. She runs our variety trials in eastern Idaho. And so she'd kind of been doing a little bit of this work as well. And so I compiled her results, and we had 41 wheat responses where she applied 38 pounds of MAP banded with the seed. And so we have three different scenarios. L10, which is a soft white winter wheat. We have Keldon, which is a hard red winter wheat under dryland conditions and irrigated conditions. And you can see that from her studies, in only 1 of 7 site years did L10 actually benefit from having that fertilizer banded next to the seed. For Keldon, 1 in 14, and in the dryland, and 1 in 20 for the hard red white irrigated situation. And the overall yield improvement was only about 5 bushels to the acre. Now, why would she likely be seeing that? Well, on our dryland soils, 1, we don't have as much of a yield potential, as you can see here. 2, when we band our in small grain systems compared to corn, our rows are on 7-inch row spacings. Maybe out here you're doing more like a 10, but for us they're 7s. And so every time that we band, that fertilizer band's only 3.5 inches away. And so it's essentially a broadcast application is really what we could think of it as. Whereas on corn, if you're on 30 or 28s or whatever your row spacing is for corn, those bands are much further apart. And so I can see definitely how when it was preached to me out here, thou shalt band your phosphorus fertilizer next to your corn seed. I can see definitely how that would definitely make sense. Idaho, like I said, is a little bit weird as well with our phosphorus recommendations. For us, we take into account free lime. And this has to do with, so we take into account free lime as part of our phosphorus recommendation. So for every 1% of free lime in the soil, we add an additional 10 pounds of P2O5 to the acre. And I actually think Idaho is the only state that does this, as we've been looking at different phosphorus recommendations across the nation. And this is based on some work done in potatoes back in 1991 through 1994, where they came up with this table. And they said, oh, this works great for potatoes. And then they said, well, we don't have money or resources to do this for barley and wheat and any other crop that we have, so we're going to accept it for barley and wheat and everything else too. My predecessor, so he was the first barley agronomist, the official barley agronomist at the state of Idaho. He did one small phosphorus trial, and he found, using the university's recommendations, okay, based on our soil test of 6.9 parts per million, soil test P using the Olson extraction, 13.2% free lime, our university would have recommended about 200 pounds of P2O5 to the acre. But when he did a field experiment, he found, it's actually only 87, so half. And so when I was hired and started looking at this, I said, okay, we need to really update our recommendations and not use potato guidelines as our barley recommendations. And so I've been conducting about 25 site years of data in barley, with most of them in malt, some in feed, some in wholest food. And our soils are generally a silt loam. You can find some sandy loams here or some loams, but for the most part, our soils are windblown soils from Oregon. Our soil test values were generally anywhere from 9 to 36. I wanted to get a nice range. So 9 to 36 parts per million. And then our phosphorus sources were either MAP, triple superphosphate, or precipitated calcium carbonate. And we've got some interesting, just as a quick side note, we've got some interesting research looking at precipitated calcium carbonate as a phosphorus source instead of as a lime amendment. So we, like you guys, grow a lot of sugar beets in southern Idaho. And Dave Tarkelson is a USDA ARS researcher at the Kimberly Research and Extension Center. And so he would apply anywhere from, he did a study in Kimberly, which already has about 15% free lime in the top foot of his soils. He applied 0, 20, and 40 tons of precipitated calcium carbonate to the acre to see how would this affect overall yields of barley rotated with sugar beet. So it was barley, sugar beet, and then wheat rotation. And when I heard about this study, I thought, man, by adding that much sugar beet lime or spent lime to the soil, surely you're going to have some caking, you're going to have some negative compaction issues. But they ran this study for 6 years, and over the 6 years, they found no significant effect in terms of, like, no negative effects from liming, even up to the 40 tons to the acre rate. They found that phosphorus that was in so sugar beet lime actually has quite a bit of phosphate in it. And despite it being in that presence of all that calcium, a lot of it was actually still fairly available even after the 6 years. And so this is something that we're going to continue looking at a little bit more, because we have massive piles of free lime or of precipitated calcium carbonate that we need to find a home for. And unfortunately, it's all on alkaline soils. So that's one of the things that my program's been looking at as well. There we go. So in terms of our recommendation, or from the things that we've seen, if you look at relative yield, so this is taking the highest yielding plot in that study, or excuse me, taking an individual plot, dividing it by the highest yielding plot from that study. What we typically see is that our relative yields ranged anywhere from about 75 to about 93%. Looking at the check plots. So these are check plots compared to pre-plant soil test. And so we're seeing, even in our check plots, they really don't have that much opportunity for improvement compared to our highest yielding plots. And in fact, most of my sites, we do not see a significant response to phosphorus applications, validating that the University of Idaho's phosphorus recommendations were too high. But part of the reason for that in our systems is that we grow, like I said, potatoes, lots and lots of potatoes, and sugar beets. And they have, at least potatoes, have a very shallow root system, but they require a ton of nutrients. And so they're throwing out all these nutrients, but then a lot of it's left over. And so when the barley and wheat come in as a crop rotation for the next 2 years, we have adequate nutrients, generally, except for nitrogen, following potatoes. One of the things I did notice is as we would go have higher and higher phosphorus rates, especially this year, you may or may not be able to tell, but most of the barley in those plots has lodged, especially at the highest rates. We would actually see a pattern of, if you have too much phosphorus, we have greater and greater incidences of the barley falling down. So the yields maybe weren't damaged, but I was also able to go much slower in my little teeny tiny 5-foot header combine than, say, you would as a producer. And so I was still able to pick up my grain and measure the yields. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of my trials looked at band versus broadcast. And for the most part, we do not see a difference in banded versus broadcast applications in our systems. But like I said, it's because our rows are much closer together, most likely. And for the most part, we generally do not have responsive sites our phosphorus requirements are much lower. Now, something that you may or may not have heard of is the fertilizer recommendation support tool. How many of you have heard of this so far? Anyone? 1, 2, 3, good. Okay, so the fertilizer recommendation support tool is a national program that is designed to reevaluate nutrient recommendations. So this is trying to get, so not only has Idaho not been keeping up to date on keeping our nutrient recommendations updated for all of our crops, but it sounds like most of the rest of the United States is at the same level. A lot of the work that was done to create the recommendations that the either private or public institutions have used is fairly old. And so this is a national initiative to modernize fertilizer recommendations by basically taking all of the known literature that we have and compiling all the raw data and putting it into a national database. And this database is available to anyone who wants to use it. And you can say, you know, I'm really only interested in this section. I only want to see the data coming from here, or I care about the data from here, or in my case, this is my data, and so I know that that's up to date. But you can select and identify what type of data you want. You can say, I don't want data from the 1970s. I don't think that's reflective of what we have now. Or you can say, I want the whole data set. And you can bring in, pick and choose what data you want, and look at the response of predominantly corn and soybean is what's in here, but there's other crops, some wheat. I've got the barley data in there now. So you can look at the response of these various crops to different fertilizer application rates, initial soil test values, and hopefully it can help you to, and you can look across state lines. You can combine Minnesota and North Dakota, or North Dakota and South Dakota, or take the entire Midwest region if that's of interest to you. And so right now it's got a data set for phosphorus, potassium. We're working on a sulfur data set, and there is soon going to be some information for liming so that we can have hopefully a better tool to help modernize our recommendations, or at least provide one great big data set that all this information is together. And so it's fairly easy to get in and look at it. You can follow it by looking at the QR code, or you can go just search fertilizer recommendation support tool. So take a moment and look at that if you want. Are there any questions about phosphorus for me? I don't have to talk about sulfur. Sounds like Brady's going to talk a lot about that. Any questions? Yeah, so anyone can contribute data to this tool. It has to be replicated data. So for example, the small plot trials or the large scale trials that myself or others have run, that can all be input into it. It has a minimum data set requirement. And so you have to provide the background information, but yeah, anyone can contribute data sets to this platform. Uh-huh.
Is that, but if it's a depletion and it's not being replaced over time, can you predict a date? Is there a 10-year supply, a 50-year supply, a 100-year supply of potassium in Idaho soils before they have to start replacing that?
If I had to guess, I'd say we're close to 20 to 30 years more at least, but depends on the soil, depends on soil texture. A lot of our soils are just natively high in potassium containing minerals. And so as they continue to weather, we just continue to have a higher supply. So like I said, 40 years ago, it was about 400 parts per million. Now we're at anywhere from, I have fields that are right next to each other that may be anywhere from about 200 to 300 parts per million still. And they're all within 1 mile of each other. And so I don't know the exact time of when are we going to have to start applying potassium, but yeah, that's kind of, we have a wide range of variability, but also we just keep mineralizing more and more potassium. Eventually we will mine it all out, but I don't know when that's going to be if we don't remediate it. Yes. So the question was, have the yields changed from the older varieties that the original recommendations were based off of till now? And yes, the yields have definitely changed. If we go back about 60 years, 40 years, 40 to 60 years, we definitely have, I think we've gone up from an average yield in our irrigated systems of, what was it? roughly about 80 bushels to the acre. So now we're up to about 140 for barley. So definitely different changes, differences. The overall, from what I've seen of the data, the overall, if we think about malt barley, they have to meet certain protein specifications. And so over the years, they've gotten better and better at controlling the amount of nitrogen that's being taken up by that crop. And so that ratio has changed. It's much harder for my growers to apply too much nitrogen or to exceed protein specifications than it is, say, with the food barley, which has a much shorter breeding period. Like, it's very much more responsive to nitrogen. And so those are some definite changes over the years for the nutrient uptake. Yep. Question was, are there a bunch of farmers who have stopped baling due to this information? There are some. They're actually paying more attention to it in some of the areas. So as we move, I can point actually from about this green dot up, that's when we start to get colder and colder temperatures. And so Idaho Falls, if you're familiar with that area, north of Idaho Falls, if we were to leave too much residue, it won't decay, it won't break down in enough time. And so they'll have to bale off a portion generally, or manage it in some way, incorporate it, heavy incorporation. Whereas further south, a lot of my growers from about Idaho Falls south, the shipping makes sense that they can take it all to the Cassia County or the central. So about here over, that's where our major dairy production areas are. And so a lot of that straw it's more economical for them to bale it off and take it out. In those same areas where the dairies are, we have quite a bit of compost and manure return, but manure return is it's much more concentrated around those dairies, and then compost goes further out. But even then, it's not getting back. That nutrient return is not making it necessarily all the way back up to that middle green dot and higher. And so we have a little bit of we still have that nutrient export and not much of a return. There is definite push to get more and more up there, but it's all shipping costs. Other questions? Yeah.
pH soils, are they using the sugar beet lime, or is the distance logistics?
Logistics is a major issue. I was talking to Brady yesterday, and just like your train tracks run east and west, ours also run east and west instead of north and south, and most of our lime is actually needed further north. And so we have a really hard time getting our lime up to northern Idaho where it's really needed up here. But even right here in Soda Springs, we have quite a bit of shipping that's going back and forth from Soda Springs, bringing, say, malt barley over into Idaho Falls, going across the mountain pass and then back down. But there's not much of a return of that sugar beet lime, so I think, let's see, in Soda Springs, where we have some lime trials right here, I think I've got the first lime that's actually been brought back into that valley. But in Ashton, they have been bringing lime back and forth up there. And so they've been liming for the last 20 years. But Soda Springs, really, it's not really been touched yet. And so that's kind of some of the work that we're doing, is identifying how much lime is actually required by these acidic soils. Sorry, the question was, is that lime being moved? And logistically, how is that? Is it logistically feasible or not? Sorry for everyone online. Brady, how much time do I have left? 15, okay. All right. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about sulfur. Sulfur, once again, important nutrient. When we see sulfur deficiency, we're going to see a yellowing in our leaves. And unlike nitrogen, sulfur is not mobile in the plant. And so that's one of the easiest ways to identify nutrient deficiency. If we look at, so when you look at this plant, if this was a nitrogen deficiency, it's going to rob nitrogen out of these lower leaves and move it up to the new leaves. Sulfur, once it's incorporated into this lower biomass, it has a much higher time being remobilized. And so we actually see that deficiency in these new leaves. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we have adequate, or at least some sulfur in the soil available all season long. If we have, and another reason why sulfur is incredibly important is you may have adequate nitrogen, but if you have inadequate sulfur, you're not going to have that good utilization of that nitrogen. It's not going to be able to convert it and turn it into protein and turn it into the amino acids and everything else that nitrogen is being turned into. So we'll have reduced nitrogen use efficiency. In Idaho, we often will use elemental sulfur to help acidify our soils, generally to make phosphorus more available. There's one company out there where their whole system is based off of sulfuric acid and either banding it or dissolving other nutrients into sulfuric acid so that it dissolves the calcium carbonate in a band, and then theoretically those nutrients are much more plant available. And then we also apply a significant amount of sulfur, not as a nutrient, but as a way to remediate our calcareous soils to improve water infiltration. For barley, we generally need about 15 times less sulfur than we do nitrogen. And so based on the initial discussion, for barley and for wheat, we need about approximately 20 pounds of sulfur per 100 bushels per acre. Sulfate sulfur is plant available, but your elemental sulfurs are not really plant available. They have to be mineralized or converted by the soil microbes into the sulfate form for that plant to be able to utilize that sulfur. Our recommendation is if we see soil sulfate sulfur less than 10 parts per million in the top 2 feet of our soil, and the sulfur content in our irrigation water is low, then we recommend applying 20 to 40 pounds of sulfate sulfur to the acre. So coming in with that information, I said, okay, well, let's go out and let's go try out a bunch of sulfur fertility studies in southern Idaho. And so we had some soils that are testing low, some that are right there, some that are very high, another one that's very low. So based on University of Idaho recommendations, we're saying, yeah, we probably would need about 20 to 40 units at, say, Aberdeen in 2021. So I ran the study, did the whole thing, and then saw no response. I said, what is going on here? That was a bunch of wasted effort. And then I had the brilliant idea to go and test my irrigation water. And so for every acre foot of water that we're applying, we're supplying anywhere from 20 to 70 pounds of sulfate sulfur to the acre. And so it made sense why I was not seeing a significant sulfur response. So we had to move off of the Snake River Plain and move into some other fields where we are not going to have too high of sulfate sulfur in the water. So we moved to some dryland fields and we moved over to the Wood River Valley. And so as part of this new study, then we looked at sulfur fertilizer sources. And so, like I mentioned, you have elemental sulfurs. And for these elemental sulfurs, your particle size matters. The bigger your particle size, you have less surface area to interact. And so it's going to take those soil microbes much longer to break that sulfur down from elemental, or to mineralize it, into sulfate sulfur. And so a good rule of thumb is about, if you're applying a prilled elemental sulfur, it's going to take, within the first year, you'll be able to mineralize about 30% of it. Sometimes we have elemental sulfur and bentonite clay, and so that helps to break it apart and get the shrink swell action, and it helps it to disperse a little bit more. But that all depends on what does your shrink swell event look like and where are your soils and how much moisture do your soils have. And then a newer product that we're seeing quite a bit more of is micronized elemental sulfur. And so, like I said, particle size matters. So you have micronized sulfur, so you have much higher surface area, and theoretically has a much higher rapid conversion to sulfate sulfur, and it's often combined with other products like urea or MAP. We also have our sulfate fertilizers like ammonium sulfate, potassium sulfate, calcium sulfate. They can be great sources. In my area, we predominantly see ammonium sulfate because it's often being applied with our herbicide tank. But also if we need some growers think, hey, I need some sulfur, or if they want to use something that's in season. We also apply thiosulfate fertilizers. We have quite a large presence for our dryland acres of using thiosulfates. Dan Kaiser at the University of Minnesota did an excellent demonstration, though, on why you would not want to apply thiosulfate as a foliar treatment. He had his soybean field and he said, hey, we've got a sulfur deficiency. We're going, and he was demonstrating this at the St. Paul campus. So we're going to top dress a light rate of ammonium thiosulfate. And the next day, all the leaves had been burned off. So be very careful with ammonium thiosol as a foliar. I would not suggest it as a foliar. I'd get it right to the soil and keep it away from the seed. So with these response trials, once again, we had sulfur response curves using ammonium sulfate as our standard for sulfur source. But then we also looked at gypsum, ammonium, so that's calcium sulfate, ammonium sulfate, potassium sulfate. Nutrien is a product that's more being used down in, say, Florida, but it's MAP-MST, so monoammonium phosphate with micronized sulfur technology. SRX Thrive, which is a micronized elemental sulfur, and then SRX Sulfur 85, which is a prilled elemental sulfur. And we are looking at 2 malt varieties, Molson Coors, Moravian 179, and Anheuser-Busch's Voyager. And looking at our initial soil test values, we're thinking, okay, we might benefit from anywhere from 11 to 30 pounds based on the University of Idaho recommendations. So in season, we've applied all these treatments. It's looking good. But one of the things I noticed in season this first year, here we have gypsum with 20 pounds of sulfate sulfur at Bellevue. And now here we have gypsum at 40 pounds of sulfate sulfur to the acre. And we're about 3 days ahead in terms of heading. But when you look at the micronized sulfur technologies, it's the opposite effect. And so I thought, oh, excellent. We are going to see some positive results. We're going to see differences due to sulfur source and sulfur rate. And then we get yield and it says, oh, there's no difference. There's no difference in terms of yield. There's no difference across the different ammonium sulfate rates. So darn, another non-responsive site. We look at sulfur sources, and once again, for the most part, there's really no difference between our fertilizer sources other than our micronized elemental sulfurs. We're producing about 9 bushels per acre more grain than our other sulfur sources. So in 2024, I said, okay, we don't need this much sulfur. We're going to go much lower rates. And so instead of doing 20 and 40, we did 4 and 12. And once again, it's like, yeah, there's maybe a difference. Let's throw in some potassium sulfate and ammonium thiosols, and the ammonium thiosol seems to be doing a little bit better, but about 15 bushels, okay. Under irrigated conditions, that's not really much of a yield difference. And so my overall key takeaway for Idaho is if I'm looking for a sulfur source, if I think I'm going to need one, I'm going to pick the cheapest sulfur source out there, and I'm going to apply a lower rate of, say, 10 to 20 pounds of sulfate sulfur to the acre if I think I'm going to need some sulfur. So that's kind of what we've come away with. Some of these other products, they may work just as well, but if a micronized sulfur technology is going to be twice as expensive as, say, just ammonium sulfate, I would go with ammonium sulfate. How much time do I have left? 5 minutes. Are there questions about sulfur? Okay, a few key takeaways for nitrogen. You know a lot about nitrogen. When I went back to Idaho, we thought, let's take a look at timing. When we plant, you have very small plants. They're not going to be taking up nitrogen. After it matures, you're going to have also additional opportunities for nitrogen loss. But our period of greatest uptake is from about Feeks 5, or when it's starting to have that pseudoerection, to when you start to have your individual tillers that are standing up, and you get all the way through boot and then through heading. So we looked at split applications. If we're going to do a split application at Feeks 5, or that pseudoerection, versus everything all at planting. And unlike corn, which I found in Minnesota works great, a split application is wonderful, especially on sandy soils. For wheat and for barley, we typically see these type of responses where a single application, this is all spring barley and spring wheat, a single application generally performs as well or better than a split application, and yet similar yields or higher yields, as was shown with this hard red spring wheat. And so for my growers, I no longer recommend a split application, except if they need to hit higher protein. We can see a protein boost with a later season application if you have adequate moisture to get that nitrogen into the crop. Now for barley, that's fine for feed and for food barley, but for malt barley, we also saw that split applications can negatively impact grain protein quality. So from about this point over, our grain protein was boosted by about 0.1 to 0.8 percentage points with a split application. But once we got to about this point over to, so where we're optimizing yield to maybe getting too much nitrogen out there, our grain protein actually jumps from 0.8 to 0.2 percentage points higher. And so if you're already at 11% protein, now you're up to 13% protein and you just exceed your malt quality protein standard. And so you may have lost your premium. But for a hard red, that might be okay. I'm going to skip this one. Now, like Brady mentioned, we've been doing some nitrogen trials. And if you want to see this in greater detail, go over to Scarlett's poster. But one of the things that we've been looking at is nitrogen sources. And can we use various nitrogen sources to improve or reduce our Scope 3 emissions? And so for North Dakota, so we have this study in North Dakota, Montana, and Idaho. And for North Dakota, we can see it didn't matter what our source was. We had similar yields except for ESN, because ESN, it requires that water to be able to move that, to get into the prill, dissolve it, and then move it back out. And for barley, we don't have a long enough growing season to take full advantage of ESN. That rate of release is too slow. Scarlett has some interesting soils data that shows that we have really high residual soil nitrogen, soil nitrate in our after harvest, especially for our ESN plots. And so ESN is not a fertilizer source I would recommend for a barley or a spring wheat. Oops. Protein was all similar. It was all within spec, so that was fine. And then the last thing that I want to point out is you may be looking at Scope 3 emissions, looking at carbon emissions, looking at you may have growers who need to quantify, especially in the malt barley industry world, who need to quantify what is their carbon footprint so that Anheuser-Busch or Molson Coors can then say, look, we are sourcing our barley responsibly. It's coming from, it's got a low carbon footprint. And so one of the biggest ways that you can impact that carbon footprint is nitrogen rate. That's what we're seeing here. This is a nitrogen response curve, 0, 65, 90, 135, 175 pounds in Idaho. And you can just see it stair steps right up. Right here is where yield is maximized. And so by applying even just 45 to 85 additional pounds of nitrogen, we're essentially releasing an additional 397 to 1,080 pounds of carbon dioxide in avoidable emissions just by over applying that nitrogen. And so one of the key takeaways that we have from our study right now is if you can get the rate right or get that optimal nitrogen rate or even a little bit lower, that's one of the biggest ways that you're going to impact that carbon footprint. And with that, I will stop talking, take maybe one last final question if we have time. One final question. And if you'll fill out that survey and hand it in to Brady at the end of the day, I'd appreciate it. Any last questions? Okay, thank you. Does Idaho have a standard soil test analysis they use for determining free lime in their soils? If so, what method is used? Do they use the calcium carbonate equivalency analysis at all? We use the WIRA 103 handbook. And so I don't have the specific name of that test off on the top of my head, but Olson, thank you. John Brecker does. Any data on amount of phosphorus, fertilizer, and lodging? Yes. If it exceeds what's required by the crop, then we start to see additional lodging. And does the lodging also correlate to the amount of nitrogen applied? In our studies, the amount of nitrogen was held constant. And so we applied the amount of nitrogen that would optimize barley yield. And then does a combination of ESN and urea and wheat provide enough early nitrogen for yield without seeing yield drag while also having some later release to boost protein? Say a 75, 25 urea ESN blend. So we've done a couple of different trials looking at winter wheat under dryland conditions, as well as barley with, so in our own study, we have, in the Idaho studies, we have ESN blended with urea, and we generally do not see in our studies that ESN has any benefit for a small grain when it's applied in the spring, even at those lower rates. It's for us, it's better to apply a top dress if we think, hey, I need to boost protein later in the season. We see a better return on our investment by just top dressing, but we also have irrigation to move that nitrogen down. For a winter wheat under dryland conditions, we don't see a yield improvement, but that's generally because in our case, the water is a more limiting factor. And so it's just a straight yield and protein response across all the fertilizer sources when we tested in wheat under dryland conditions. Cool. Thanks for having me back in North Dakota and in the Midwest.